why don't we get started? Welcome everyone to the first installment of second term of Histories of Race and Capitalism. We're really thrilled to have Sharad Chari with us today. But before I get started, I'd love to acknowledge and thank my co-organizers. Let me start by saying my name is Hengam Ziai. I'm a lecturer in the history of the Middle East and Africa here at SOAS, and I'd like to thank Sarah El-Kazaz, Samia Khatun, Lisa Tilly, who unfortunately has had a family emergency and can't be with us today, and of course Kanchan, who recently passed her Viva and is now Dr. Kanchan. I'm going to say something about the format of our seminars for those of you who are new to this space. So the way we usually do it is that we ask people attending to take a look at the chapters that we pre-circulate. And then we ask our speaker to offer 20 minutes of conversation or reflections on the text. So it's quite a sort of, limited sort of presentation in the hope that we ourselves are going to be engaging with some of the substantive arguments that have been made in the text. And then we're going to have a respondent respond to the text for 7 to 10 minutes. Before we open up to the audience, so please, be ready with your questions, not just questions, but also comments and engagements. And usually what we do, it sometimes works very well, sometimes less well, is that we ask the speaker not to respond for a little while whilst we get the sort of debate and the conversation going before sort of reopening the floor. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce both our speaker and our commentator. So Sharad Chari is a professor in the Department of Geography and co-director of the program in Critical Theory at Berkeley, California. His most recent books are, of course, Apartheid Remains and Gramsci at Sea, and out later this year, Beverly Ditsy's Fearless Speech. He and Carolyn Stoltz are also editing the final volume of the Cambridge History of Colonialism and Decolonization, which they are calling The Colonial Present and the Planetary Demand. And that is, inshallah, out in 2027. And Sarah El-Kazaz doesn't need an introduction here, of course, but I'll introduce her nonetheless. She is senior lecturer in politics at SOAS and author of Politics in the Crevices, Urban Design and the Making of Property Markets in Cairo and Istanbul. Her research interests include critical political economy, urbanism and infrastructure, and digital politics. And her new book project investigates the politics of digital infrastructure by following cloud technologies across the global south. So,
thank you, Hangame and Samia and Lisa and Absentia, to Sarah and we. Thanks to this series. I've been following this series, and I haven't watched all the talks. I mentioned this, but it's a great honor to be here. It's really an amazing. And I was actually also saying, the idea of a Walter Rodney collective without having to pay for capital costs and so on. It's pretty great. We should all be doing this sort of thing. Thanks to Walter Rodney also, obviously, for starting the conversation on the remains of and the infrastructures of colonial capitalism that we're all still stuck with. And I also like to begin by thanking the late Peter Mackenzie, whose photograph is on the cover. And I'll pass it around. Let's flog my book, but also his surviving widow, Nifa Mackenzie, who allow me to use the photograph. I'll send it around. I'll pass it around. It's a photograph of neighborhoods next to oil refineries, and has a little joke for the Londoners in it. So look on the cover, Petticoat Lane. So this is a photograph of an informal settlement next to oil refinery, and there's a little joke for the Londoners in it, which tells us something about the way in which the imperial is folded into apartheid's geographies. And I also say, please judge the book by the cover. The title is Apartheid Remains, and I definitely don't mean that apartheid remains. I mean it as a kind of something to puzzle over. The whole book puzzles over why the remains of various pasts are so difficult to dislodge from spaces, bodies, psyches, environments, political imaginations, and dreams of the future. here and in other places as well. As we look outward, I try to look outward from a particular landscape, and yet people to continue to strive for something else. So the book is anchored. If you imagine a city of hills gently coming down to the sea, the Indian Ocean, and this a city that in certain ways imagine itself as an English city with the bungalows that are now in decay, or that kind of Englishness itself in decay in a sense, and taken over by the Afro-Asian city that it actually is. With a port in the middle of as you descend down towards the ocean, port connected to the minerals boom, which transformed this entire landscape. Southern Africa shaped its fundamentally non-democratic, regressive nature of Southern African political economy. In a way that is telescoped back into a particular geography south of the port, which is a little valley with an industrial residential patchwork quilt of neighborhoods and industry that because of this valley, kind of people's lives are soaked in benzene, and sort of it's a toxic landscape. And I look out from two neighborhoods, one formerly Indian and still very much Indian neighborhood of Merebank, and formerly colored, still very much colored neighborhood of Wentworth, colored being the racial category, a racial term for people who are racially mixed. And I don't say so-called colored, is what people say in South Africa, because I don't say so-called Indian. Both of them are racial categories that are products of and conceal complex histories of unfree labor, forced movement, and also conviviality and placemaking. What seem like similar things, apartheid township, racial townships, are actually products of very different spatial histories. Merebank was a post-indenture landscape of peri-urban worker peasants. So the area around Durban was part of the global plantation belt, and former plantation workers now in a part of this peri-urban landscape that is then ethnically transformed into a class-differentiated township with one of the longest histories of civic mobilization in the country. And Wentworth is a product of a multiplicity of trajectories of people who were classified colored when they were forcibly moved to a township where they shared little else except histories of precarious tenancy, labor, and movement. So that is that precarity, and that is a fundamental thing they share. And they're sort of reeling with this notion of suddenly becoming colored. And so this idea of Wentworth in the mirror of Merebank is a kind of device for narrating what is specific about the racial and racial spatial borderlands of the apartheid city and pre-apartheid, apartheid, post-apartheid city. And also as a way of thinking about very different political histories in these areas in the 70s and 80s. So the book uses the neighborhoods as a portal into a wider account of 20th century South Africa and what we're left with in the 21st. It's divided into two parts. Part one reflects on the 1900s to the 1970s. Part two focuses on the revolutionary 70s and 80s and its remains in the 21st century. Part one is called Racial Palimpsest. Palimpsest being a document that's written over many times, a piece of paper in City Hall with all the mayor's minions, notes and so on. It's a many-layered thing. And it provides a burden, opportunity, a possibility of possibilities of readings of possibilities that aren't fully foreclosed. Way of thinking palimpsestically about a city or landscape of the present in a way in which not everything is in the present tense. That's what I attempt. And also in thinking about racial capitalism, I try to think about, I think the term itself invites thinking about how capitalist realities are bolstered by prior forms of authority, power, authority, privilege, and so on. I think that's what this neologism points to. So thinking palimpsestically offers a method of narrating history of space in which there are distinctive periods in which leave behind different remains. So as things as conjunctures shift. As I said, part one is about the 1900s to the 1970s. When in the 1970s, late 60s, 70s, being the period when apartheid capitalism entered a period of intractable political and economic crisis. When one thing stands out in this long period is that the racial state constantly tried to transform people and places, but with very little knowledge of what was going on the ground. The form of power without knowledge, as Keith Breckenridge, colleague and friend in South Africa, puts it. There are particular forms of knowledge that are important, forms of biopolitical expertise, new forms of expert knowledge that we know of as public health, urban planning, social work, and so on, meant to transform people and places into governable objects before, during, and after apartheid. And because the state really didn't know what was happening on the ground, it was doing this without, it typically turned to a police form of biopolitical government, coercive form that generated new waves of struggle, including struggles over in the terrain of biopolitics, when people picked up the tools of public health planning, social work, and so on as tools of struggle over racial capitalism, in many ways remaking the nature of racial capitalism itself. The book starts with the Anglo-Boer concentration camps of the early 20th century, which is where forms of biopolitical expertise arrive. It then turns through memories to think of memories from these two places, to think about how forms of memory literally settle in the city of the past and its peripheries. And there, the major story, which is, I think, quite interesting, is a story of subaltern space making after indenture, where peasant workers rooted themselves in the peripheries and interstices of the city, making what is still, in all senses, Indian Durban. It's still visibly, audibly, edibly Indian Durban. And it's everywhere in the cracks of what was meant to be a white city. Memory conventions from colored Wentworth, in contrast, are ceaselessly creative. They point to forms of loss, dispossession, precarity in work and tenancy that is, again, difficult to pin down or name. And I'm indebted to the work of Habiba Badroun and Patrick Tarek Mellett and others who've tried to rethink this question of coloredness in new ways. Anyway, the 30s and 40s, the local state becomes more emboldened. Its forms of progressivism and industrialization, and again, using a police form of biopolitical intervention that only sowed more seeds of struggle. And importantly, in the 1940s, these were gendered forms of struggle that have been well documented by feminist political economists. And just want to highlight the work of a friend of some of us, Shireen Hassam, who points out the way in which the women's struggles in the 1940s stitched together, in her words, the political and the seemingly non-political forms of women's agency in rural and urban South Africa. There's a groundswell of struggle, which I think of also in relation to this sort of failure of the biopolitical, or the contradictions of biopolitical territorialization. And this only becomes more baroque in the apartheid period. I think of the apartheid era as an attempt to build a science fiction reality of forced estrangement, which again just becomes more strange. And what's interesting, thinking from these neighborhoods, is that Wentworth and Merebank are places that become incredibly importantly creative in political, cultural terms, in sport, in jazz, in music, in all sorts of ways, as a product of becoming apartheid townships, which is a very difficult thing to historiographically, in popular historiography. There are these places that are memorialized because they were lost through apartheid's forced removals for these things, for jazz and politics and collective life of a kind. These are places that are products of apartheid that were like that. Part two is about the revolution that was and wasn't. It's called Remains a Revolution. And so was and wasn't, depending on where you look at how. Just true of all revolutions, I think. So I tease apart four moments or strands, and they're spatiotemporal and interconnected. The first is a communitarian strand. That's chapter 6. We were just chatting about. In some ways, my favorite chapter. It's a reinterpretation of the incredible political inventiveness in Durban in the early 1970s, called the Durban moment. It begins with a dock workers' strike, spreads out into a multifaceted revolt, really. And Steve Biko was a resident in the neighborhood. So I look at him, and he inspired some young people who are in exciting ways to take what I think of as a leap of political faith, in the hope of fundamentally transforming personhood and space through political blackness. And that current continues in other ways and inspires other young people later in this period when this Black consciousness movement is brutally repressed. Well, some people were drawn to Black consciousness and to this political effervescence. Others were drawn into the armed struggle, to what I call the moment of insurrection, which took people to exile, to a thicket of intrigue and infiltration. Also, in this particular area in Meerbank, what was interesting was that there was a kind of web-like form that supported people in the armed struggle coming in and out of the country, an underground link to some kind of civic life, and it's quite a kind of web-like form which anticipated the long internal critique within the external mission of the ANC, the African National Congress, and the South African Communist Party, which of their model of armed struggle by remote control of groups coming in and making armed sabotage attacks from outside the country. We can talk about these. The thing that becomes clear is, just as the state had very little knowledge of what was going on the ground throughout from the 1900s to the 1970s, the movement in exile also had very little knowledge of what was going on the ground. That they keep saying this, and they so much so that they were reluctant to come to terms with the fact that they had nothing actually to do. I'd say very little to do, let's say, with the internal struggles of the 1970s, this political effervescence of the Durban moment, the dock worker strikes, the independent Black trade union movements, the student uprisings that then would become 1976, community struggles, and so on. Really an internal political, awakening. And that led to maybe the third moment, which is I call the moment of urban revolution, that tried to bring together the communitarian and insurrectionist moments in a concerted strategy of urban revolution, controlled by a small group of men in Durban, and very powerfully. And they promised to connect these strands in a coordinated struggle that held the possibility of the return of the external mission of the ANC and SACP as a hegemonic force of the future and a platform for the future, which in a way worked. And it included people from Meerbank. It anticipated what was already happening, that web-like form. And it also includes people who were drawn into one of the most daring missions of the external mission, which is called the Operation Vula, which it's quite a mythologized thing also, but it brought in materiel for a potential people's war. It created a kind of proto-internet infrastructure, people holding up calculators, hexaphones, and messages sent by phones to Muswell Hill, to a guy sitting in Muswell Hill who would decode them and send them to Oliver Tambo in Lusaka. It was quite a feat, that aside, this urban revolutionary moment was also one in which planners and geographers and medical experts and lawyers were drawn into the urban movement in ways that opened the possibility of radical determination of urban life. There's something else was also emerging. But it was not actually built on a lived anti-authoritarianism, which takes me to what I call the moment of the disqualified, the experience of those who were left behind by the urban movement. who had particularly compelling ways of looking into the wounds of racial segregation and apartheid in ways that the others didn't. And this included saboteurs, and this was part of interpreting a particularly difficult group of saboteurs who were one step removed from the leadership of the ANC in exile. And they're kind of a self-organized sabotage group that conducted they're remembered for an infamous car bombing on the Durban beachfront of 2 beachfront cafes, and something, you know, out of Battle of Algiers, but something that they never really have transitioned. None of the people in that cell have transitioned from terrorists to struggle heroes. They've been caught in the transition, and they also inhabit the fault line, the boundaries between crime and politics, which are the condition of global blackness. I also look at these saboteurs in relation to photographers who also looked into the wound of racial violence in a particularly compelling way, picked up a camera rather than, they picked up a Canon something rather than an AK-47. Peter Mackenzie on the cover of this book is also one of them. They use the visual as a means of critical. I'm going to wrap up. The book begins and ends with photographs. There's an argument through the visual and to thinking, and particularly through looking at Black documentary photographers who in the 90s and 2000s were returning to their negatives and also performing a kind of palimpsestic form of critique by returning to their negatives to say, what other stories could we have told about apartheid South Africa? Peter Mackenzie is one of my interlocutors there. Patricia Hayes, historian of this moment. So there's a story about how the forgeries of Black life, as Cedric Robinson puts it, are become, through the work of political photographers, something else. And there's an attempt at using photography in struggle. Another red thread is women's activism in all its forms, radical women's activism at various moments. Again, keeping in mind the way in which the political and the apparently non-political are sutured in women's activism, particularly in social work, nursing, community development, and so on, areas that were transforming biopolitical struggle in important ways. And I think as sites in which people conserve the means of struggle across prolonged periods of violence, such as we witness, today in Palestine and other places. And lastly, this is a book, it's a love letter to Durban. So for those of you who are Durbanites or Durban Fundis here, yeah, it's a love letter to Durban, as literally a place that the Black Atlantic and the Indian Ocean collide and create and offer a different story to the world. And I'll stop there. Say something.
All right. Thank you so much, Sharad, for being here and for sharing this incredible book that I have to say, trying to work through how to respond to it itself was both fun and terrifying. But it's for those who haven't had the chance to read it yet. It's an incredibly rich book, both theoretically and empirically. You've heard Sharad kind of already give you an introduction to it, but it grapples with the making, negotiation, and direct confrontation of apartheid in South Africa, deploying a Black feminist Marxist lens to view that. From the very kind of particular geographies of South Durban, and particularly Meerbach and Wentworth, which had been classified under apartheid as Indian and colored, which I want to come back to. But I just want to say this is kind of one of those rare books that for me was just punctuated by the unexpected. I loved that I was continuously surprised by its character, its spaces, the theory that comes out of it, where it comes out. I felt like I was on, constantly stumbling on gems, and it's an incredible journey of reading. So I can't recommend enough spending the time to work with it. Now, I've only had a chance to read about 2/3 of it, so apologies if some things are missing. but I will say some of the things that really surprised me as I, got into the book and in the best way, right? Elated me, I guess. I was surprised that the book started with concentration camps created by the British for white Afrikaner women and children to think about the biopolitical during the Second Anglo-Boer War. And it was so interesting because I had just expected to plunge into Merebank and Wentworth, and I didn't, right? But from it, really kind of honed on this question of the invisibility of the Black African in that project, in that colonial project. I was surprised to read South African Apartheid from the Indian Ocean. I'll come back to it a lot. I was surprised to see the careful and nuanced well, not surprised, but really excited to see it. The differentiation between the Indian and the colored in chapter 2. I was, it was so interesting to read about Black radical theological politics and resistance from spaces that were officially demarcated as non-Black. I was so excited to see photography build theory as it does so beautifully in this book. And I was, it was remarkable to read Steve Biko side by side with Pooh Moodley, Jaya, Fanon, Graeber, Bob Marley, Greta, women's Pentecostal prayer groups, a Black Benjamin, Peter Mackenzie, Cedric Robinson, and many others kind of animating this politics of apartheid, living it together, not just through text, but through praxis, through shared spaces. It was just mind-blowing. So from here, I guess I want to grapple with maybe 4 theoretical points. You can stop me when I'm not timing myself, by the way.
Sure.
So the first one I want to go to is around this question of debt. In chapter 2, we are confronted with David Graeber. I thought I was kind of like, whoa, okay, cool. And I'm going to actually read the quote on page 95 to center kind of your theoretical intervention here. Settlements of memory in Merebank and Wentworth point to debts that remain beyond the mythic restitution of land or autochthony. These debts can never be entirely settled. I have sought to evoke precise vectors of loss as retrospective claims on the future. But there is more to re-memory, Seth calls it, than getting the past right. Re-memory sits with lingering debts of uncompensated dispossession or unrequited attachment. So I wanted to sit with this idea of debt in this chapter because there's an interesting argument around how memories and the tracing lineages around indentured servitude in the Indian neighborhood of Merebank creates a particular work of placemaking that is rooted in a way that you don't see in Wentworth with colored populations. And especially because of the way in which quite a forced movement, dispossession, and I guess that I thought it was really interesting because there isn't that like memory of a particular debt that society owes them, like indentured servitude. And there's an interesting kind of dealing with that in terms of memory and restitution and commemoration and so on. But what was much more powerful for me in this chapter is to grapple with the idea that an argument that I think you might be possibly making, and I'm wondering if you are, around how having that kind of place-based, clear tracing of that debt creates a space for making life. For a much more kind of energetic and kind of class-based, I guess, the civic tradition that you talk about that is much more stable in Merebank than in Wentworth. And I was curious if you saw that the kind of tracing of that debt produces that stability and productive kind of space for that community as opposed to the community of Wentworth. or if I read that completely wrong. Kind of curious what you think. The second question or kind of intervention I wanted to grapple with is around this question that I think is fascinating of biopolitical resistance or biopolitical uprising that comes up in chapter 4 and again in several other places, including chapter 6. So in chapter 4, we sit with social medicine quite a bit and community efforts around nursing and also care, like in care work. And so this is one of the chapters where women are very much centered in the book in a really kind of productive and powerful way. And it opened up a lot of questions for me about how to think about the biopolitical, and it especially comes from a problematic that you pose on page 143. I'm just going to read it out if you guys don't mind. So we're talking about Boo Moodley, who's a really important character in the book, and she was a nurse in one of the kind of spaces that are creating this kind of community work around medicine. One of your analyses, you're saying, quote, "Indeed, to be a nurse with a political conscience and by all accounts a daring personality meant that she could radicalize the notion of care work, to turn very crucially to the fundamental problem of modern segregation. How to critique the racialization of biopolitical tools without giving up on the radical hope of universal access to the means of life. This is the fundamental question concerning biopolitical struggle." I really liked sitting with this, right? There's a tendency for us to want to really critique biopolitical control, biopolitical planning, the states that come with that, the governmentality that comes with that. But then we have to ask ourselves the question of how do you provide universal access to the means of life, as you so nicely put it. And what, I guess, to salvage from some of those, is there anything to salvage from an institutional take on universal care? How? Where? This kind of reminded me of a conversation that was happening in one of the journals that I work with, Economy and Society. They had this panel because they felt as a journal that as working with neoliberalism, they had kind of really beat on the state very hard. And at some point they were like, is it time to ask ourselves what's salvageable from the state? Have we beat on it too hard? And are we in a point in time in history where beating on it is actually not very productive? And so I kind of opened up a parallel with this question. I wonder where you would take that. It also connects really nicely to what you talk about in chapter 6 about the Association for Self-Help, right? Now you kind of talk about it from kind of the moment of struggle, and you have a really nice connection to self-determination in the chapter. But then we ultimately see its work happening in the community, right? Through housing, through medical work, and so on. And I wondered, I'm someone who's thought about self-help a lot because I studied neoliberalism. And I've always thought about it in terms of co-optation, right? The problematics of that. But sitting with how you were talking about it, I ultimately wondered, if we're looking at it as a modality of liberation rather than survival, which is a lot of how we read self-help in some of the geographies I'm studying, does that offer us a different tool thinking about community work and its hope, even in a neoliberal moment? So just wanted to kind of pose that. Am I still okay to keep going?
We usually have 2 responses.
Yeah, fair. Okay, so I get some space. Then in chapter 6, again, you bring us to Black radical theology, which is just so interesting, how you kind of grapple with it. And we have this wonderful quote from page 207 that centers Steve Biko in his thought. And you're kind of analyzing some of his work or the movement and what he's saying as follows, quote, Radical Black theology is not incidental. It is fundamental to a conception of political faith in the possibility of dismantling the deep material inequalities and moral injustices sown by apartheid's spatial fix. Consider that in the relation between the three epigraphs that open this chapter, Biko stages a condition of Black personhood. You are on your own, quote. The need to, quote, unquote, pump life into it, to inculcate pride and dignity, and a declaration that these techniques of the self are not just key to a, quote, program of emancipation. This is God's plan, end quote. This is precisely an argument about political faith. I found that really interesting, especially because Henny and I had a conversation about this about 10 minutes before I started reading the chapter. And it was kind of really eerie to see. So Henny's writing an amazing book about Messianism and the Mahdi in the Sudan. And we just randomly, I don't know how this happened, but we were talking about political faith and justice. And I wondered, do you see political faith as essential to a social justice agenda in the world that we live in today? And what is political faith? Is it tied to particular understandings of theology? And if so, given kind of where religion stands today, where does the movement towards justice sit in its relationship to religion? Or does it have to be religion when we talk about faith? It's kind of an open question. One of the interesting things in this chapter is to think about the church from Wentworth and Mearbank. And I wondered about, we're talking about youth that organize around Black theology, who are not necessarily all Black, who are multiple genealogies, right? And I wondered about their own religious traditions and how they mixed, whether it's Islam, Hinduism, others, and how that may have come into their interactions with the church. I wonder if you have like seen some of that tension or productive for thinking about that struggle. Finally, I'll say two little things. One thing is I wondered, the refinery is really interesting, right? As someone who cares about infrastructure, I thought I would see it all through the book in a very kind of aggressive way, or not aggressive, but like central way. But actually didn't see as much of it as I expected. It kind of bookended the book. And I wondered, why is that the case, right? I mean, obviously toxicity and labor and so on come in, but the refinery and oil are not as present. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that decision. And finally, this is something we talked about before the session, but this book centers hope in a really important way. And I think I just want to say that, like, I really appreciate work that is centering political hope, especially in this moment of genocide, of this very active supremacist geopolitics. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to actually elevate a politics of hope. And I wondered if you have any reflections on that, since you put it up front in the intro. And yeah, thank you so much. That was incredible.
Thank you.
Great set of comments, Sarah. Few minutes to respond to some of those.
Sure. How many minutes?
Quotes. Should we say for 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to the audience for a broader discussion.
Yeah, brilliant comments, Sarah. Thank you. Let's see. I began with the concentration camps because the concentration, they're on the same site actually. So it's a plastic landscape. People change, the places change, and it was a sort of interesting. It also is meant to be a, and something unexpected, a provocation. Interestingly, the kind of protagonist in that chapter is this Victorian reformer, Emily Hobhouse. Her brother was at the LSE and all that, and she's like goes to part of the women's, what was it called? The women's committee, the ladies' committee. something sexist, but they women, so reformers. She's the first to go. Actually, she kind of breaks the story about these camps, and and then the U.S. press, they're called death camps, um, and she is later on sort of her mea culpa as, yes, we did forget the Black African camps. It wasn't just the white thing. Because then these become sites of memory and sites of white of Afrikaner nationalism. In these neighborhoods, there are these concentration camp cemeteries which was zoned off as little white pockets in the bizarreness of apartheid. As little white pockets for students to come and kind of like do little, there's like amphitheater to bring students to look at this. This is a kind of originary wound for Afrikaner nationalism. But anyway, there's a lot to say about the camps, and I just was drawn into it. And one of my reviewers, interestingly, I'll just say it, but thinks I'm like this Victorian reformer. So I'm like this white woman from London, but I don't know. We have strange echoes we don't expect. So then another juxtaposition of figures that you point to. That passage from David Graeber, do you have the page number?
Yes.
Because there's another passage on that page.
Yes.
I can use your copy. Do you remember what the page was? Graeber has this wonderful line about look it up.
It's 90.
Okay.
But
So
it comes earlier also in 63 and 64.
thank you so much. Maybe I'll just remember it. 95. I did write this at some point.
You said it was 10 years in the making, so
20. I mean, 10 years of writing. He says this thing. I can't even read it anymore. But he says something like debt is a relation that people can't walk away from yet, or something. Do you remember it, Henrika? You're nodding your head. It's a relation that people can't yet walk away from, something like that. And I just was drawn to that. Look, I mean, in a book like this, you have that
On
quote.
the bottom.
there we go.
That's the relation between groups who, and this is a quote, cannot yet walk away from each other because they are not yet equal. Then he adds, hopefully, in the shadows of eventual equality. I think that's interesting. Death is a relation between groups who cannot yet walk away from each other because they are not yet equal. While he adds, hopefully, in the shadows of eventual equality. Look, I mean, this is not a formulation that lends itself to diagnosing specific relations. I don't know, maybe it is. It's one of those things that formulations that I just sat with, along with Toni Morrison's Setha, and from Beloved, and Beloved is all about the debt relation as well, and then embodied and lived and returning in the form of the two daughters. Also relations that you can't yet walk away from, with the horizon of equality or a social justice struggle in the background, yeah, so I pose this as kind of in this philosophical way without it, without it being I think it doesn't do I don't do the kind of work that you're asking for there, but it's something. There are these moments in this book, I think, that I raise formulations that, I think I just raise them. There's something there, I think, in the way in which people who are marked by a debt relation, former indentured descendants of indentured laborers, who in a way celebrate that history of that relation. This one, so someone brought up the Roma revolving restaurant in Durban that was shielded from all taste during apartheid, and this waiter when I was there pointed out to the bay and said, or the bartender pointed out to the bay and said, "We arrived here, we landed here." I mean, that relationship of his ancestors' arrival was so it was still there for him. What do I do with this? I'm not sure, but there's something about the proximity of the debt relation to descendants of indentured labor who can celebrate it, whereas thinking of coloreds versus Indians in a way, the coloredness through when it's not so much about identity, its entailments are about land, about dispossession and tenancy, labor and land, and the loss of, and then in the kind of long histories of insecure access to labor and land. So there's something there that I just thought was interesting. It's sort of not quite an answer to your question. That's the second question about biopolitical struggle. Thank you for that. I mean, I have a frustration with the concept of biopolitics kind of lands from on high, and it's too beholden to sovereignty. Actually, it's all about how the sovereign power to kill. It becomes that, right? That biopolitical becomes the necropolitical, becomes the obliterative violence we witness and Israeli violence. But is that necessarily the only history of I'm doing a kind of Marxist reading of Foucault here, right? A Marxist reading of these biopolitical forms, these forms of knowledge that become forms of struggle. Social medicine is, I mentioned to you earlier, social medicine. This is one of the sites of the emergence of social medicine in the 1940s. And when they see the specter of the apartheid state coming, they see the clampdowns, these progressive doctors who are interested in, helping transform people's lives, interested in community health, and so on. Where do they go? To the new state of Israel. They go to Israel to be part of the project there, which is also a progressive project. And when Nasser is coming, Nasser Abu-Rami's book is, in a way, picks up this story about, in his amazing book which is about the apartheid infrastructure of Israel. In a way, he picks up on this, I think, through urban planning. Yeah, and my partner's a nurse, so it's like kind of like this whole obsession of mine of nurses and the social work as the side of struggle. It's important. I did want to say, yeah, and that thank you for picking up on that notion of the politics of the book is about kind of rescuing the notion of biopower to demand universal access to the means of life, through the pandemic and after. But Alale Khalili, has asked me this question, which I did want to bring into the room. It's a powerful question. She asks me if biopolitical struggle is enough in the face of imperial violence, in the face of the right to maim, and just Pierre Poirot's terms, or my colleague Samara Asmayer calls it, it's obliterative violence, and obviously not in a way, right? So in a way, I would come back to Gramsci and to the war of position, war of movement, right? And biopolitical struggle is still on the terrain of the war of position. It's the rear guard. It's the rear guard radical political work that is necessary, but all the war of movement is also, becomes important at other moments. But that you pointed to this group, the Association for Self-Help, ASH, which was a group of young activists in Durban who were Indian and colored in these neighborhoods, who refused to be Indian and colored in these neighborhoods, affirmed being Black, and became part of this Black formation. And their inspirations were from what was happening in the US, in Black Power in the US, when Black Power also turned to forms of self-help, radicalized as Black Power beyond the military form, but maybe beyond or around, maybe in relation to the military form. I think Lale's question is an important one. That is not, it's not a kind of teleology either, right? Yeah, a point about political faith, and there's a kind of question there about theological politics, the political theology, and the theological political fragment, and a kind of Black critical reading of Benjamin, that Black Benjamin, it conjures a Black Benjamin. There's a lot of conjuring, and you have to forgive me. There's a kind of religious, aspect. But I actually just try to think the people who talk about that, what was happening in Durban in the 70s, say it was like it's beyond explanation. It's they and I did find Judith Butler's reading of Benjamin useful there, that thinking about another time traversing historical time, some sense of something else, an opening. But an opening can take different, can open, can become a genocide. An opening can become various things. Openings are also yeah, they're it doesn't have to be religion. Well, your answer to faith and but something about political faith became important. Yeah, I brought in I thought the book was too despairing, and I kind of brought in the hope and the faith, and well, the political faith was there in that thing, but I did kind of bring it back in. Again, we were talking about this, but as a kind of we have to be relentlessly pessimistic, but yet we have young people in our lives. We have the future in sight, and we have to. There's no other way, because people under dire conditions obviously do. The refinery does recede in the background, and I do have some friends in context who are in the labor struggles do say, yeah, where's our labor struggles, and they kind of do recede. It was like just too much. It was enough. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So at this point, I think we're going to open it up to questions and comments from the audience. So please raise your hands if you'd like to weigh in.
Hi, thank you so much.
What's your name? Sorry.
My name is Zoe. I'm currently completing my PhD in Human Geography and Urban Studies at the
Great.
LSE. So I was just curious, because as you're talking about, political hope and the importance of political hope, I thought a lot about Durban post 2021 with the riots that occurred, right? And how already there were considerable ruptures that had occurred in terms of infrastructure, both physical but also social, within the city. And I was quite curious in terms of your thoughts around, the afterlives of what the politics of hope would look like in the current context of Durban. Yeah.
Do you study Durban? Are you from Durban, or do you study?
No, I was born in Durban, but my research focuses on Black queer placemaking in Johannesburg, London. So yeah.
Should we get
Let's
a couple?
sorry.
If there's anybody else who wants to. Yeah, is it that?
Hi, so I'm Lucy Garbett. I'm also finishing my PhD at LSE. So I read parts of the book, but not all of it. So apologies if you do deal with this.
No, apologies to you.
So just seeing you. So I was curious about the use of the term biopolitical struggle and biopolitical uprising. And I'm wondering what types of modalities you see that taking place in, like how are you seeing biopolitical struggle? How do you research it? And I ask this also because I study Palestine, I'm also Palestinian, but also, so the terms there have been used like insurgent social reproduction or infrastructures of resistance, whereby people are organizing around, and obviously in the settler colonial context, life making is political, and it is politicized and has been seen as such as part of Palestinian revolutionary and political movements and organizing struggles. So in that sense, the term social reproduction or resistance economy or other terms have been used. And so I'm reading it almost with that in parallel, and I'm curious as to how that's seen. And so in Palestine, it was like through agricultural committees, women's committees providing childcare, or the different ways in which life was, healthcare committees, things like that, that was seen in these ways of the ways we need to reproduce life in the face of a regime that does not want us to. And so I'm curious if you could tell me a bit more about how you reached biopolitical struggle, what makes it struggle, what makes one insurgency, was it uprising, sorry. Yeah.
Anybody else want to jump in? Samia?
There was also someone else.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so I read this very much from Australia, and as someone who becoming was in Australia, I love reading work on South Africa. I love reading South African writers. It's very because of the presence of South African political idioms in anti-racist movements in Australia, and had the kind of ongoing dialogue that there is. And I found it really compelling that the Apartheid Remains title for me immediately signaled a politics of hope, because weirdly in Australia, that's also that's often a clarion call for anti-racist politics of hope. Apartheid remains in Gaduga, apartheid remains in whatever, in order to address it. So it was part of my own politicization in the 2000s, this kind of call for apartheid remains, yeah? So one of the things I wanted to ask you about kind of buttresses or sort of jumps off from Sarah's final point about political theology, in that early politicization in Australia, the Black theology movements or liberation theology movements in Aboriginal Australia that really saw apartheid and anti-apartheid movements as sort of reaching for a global Black consciousness, there's an alternative spatiality that really grounds a lot of those movements. And in part, that's because so much of it is informed by land rights, Aboriginal land rights. So I found myself reading your work, looking for that parallel. And I wondered whether you've come across it in your research, or is there a chapter that points to it? And in the Australian context, you know, it becomes a concept of country, which is a sort of universal umbrella category that bring an Aboriginal English word that brings together concepts of place and space that, you know, hundreds of different Aboriginal groups and peoples are embedded in, but this concept of country claims a intellectual genealogy to the non-colonial. And I guess I wondered, and the reason that this connected to me, for me, with the political theology question that Sarah raised, is that in some ways, in grounding the liberation version of Black liberation theology in Australia in ideas of country, Aboriginal activists actually sidestep that category of religion. It's not religion so much that is interwoven with Black theology, but it's country, which is in many ways a different epistemic ground from which they're articulating things. So I wondered whether, yeah, your actors, the movements you looked at have that kind of alternative spatial articulation somewhere there.
Thanks.
Sorry, you wanted to...
Do you want to answer, or should
Please, Najat.
keep coming? Okay.
We can also talk to each other. I say that every
Yeah.
time. I'm
You
going to
can
do that in a
answer-
second. So
You can answer some questions.
I'm Majid Akhtar. I'm from the Department of Geography at King's College London, and we had a reading group on racial capitalism, and we read your book as a part of it, and it's a fantastic book and fun to read together in groups as well, I would say. So my question is about how you finished your talk. It's really evocative of where the Indian Ocean meets the Atlantic, and I noticed that the title for the reading, the series is also Beyond the Atlantic. So I wonder how do you think about regions in global racial capitalism? We think about global Blackness in Durban, but is there global Blackness in Malaysia or Indonesia, or how far you extend that category, and how do you think about subalternity in that concept as well? Because is subalternity more general, or is global Blackness a subset? Or yeah, just kind of how do you see the Indian Ocean playing into global racial capitalism? I mean, your book is in part an answer to that, but I'm curious as to how far it extends. And
Not a good enough answer.
Yeah. but no, it's a great answer. I'm also trying to make it travel, for my own selfish reasons. So I would
What are your selfish reasons?
studying the rubber frontier in Malaya and kind of the enrollment of Indian labor in that.
I'm just going to abuse my position and jump in and speak to
Please.
some of the some of the points that have been made, sort of maybe reinforcing some of the questions. I mean, I was thinking sort of along those lines. I was fascinated by, of course, as we've already discussed, the bringing together of the Indian Ocean into our understanding of a Black radical tradition, if I'm reading you sort of correctly, and sort of asking myself, and again, I've not made it through the entirety of the book yet, but what does that do to the concept of tradition when you kind of respatialize it in this way? And I sensed in your text, I don't know if it's a sort of deliberate or sort of less conscious sort of pushback against an ontologizing understanding of Blackness that I think has maybe become more prominent since BLM, at least, and something that we've been sort of engaging with indirectly through the seminar series. We actually didn't call it histories of racial capitalism. We didn't even call it racial capitalism, and I think there was a deliberate sort of separation of race and capitalism as a kind of provocation. That's not to dismiss racial capitalism, but as a way of maybe starting the conversation from a different site, and as you rightly pointed out, beyond the Atlantic, Africa, Asia. And so it would be really interesting for me if you could more explicitly, I mean, you've done it in the book, but kind of articulate what an Indian Ocean sort of imaginary offers us in terms of how we think about the category of race, the category of Blackness. And then just, I had similar questions, but Lucy put it very well about sort of biopolitics. I've, myself been very much trained to associate the biopolitical with a project, obviously projects of sovereignty, projects of the state, but also the idea of the population and colonial modernity and the objectification of life. And so it was very provocative for me to, in this book, kind of so forcefully disentangle sovereignty, race, violence from a biopolitical kind of activism or sort of insurgency. And so what I also noticed some hesitation even in the text with respect to that. If I'm correct, when you talked about sort of the critique of a sort of reformism that comes from people like maybe Ruth Wilson Gilmore. So I mean, I'd love to hear more about some of the pitfalls of maybe too quickly taking on that sort of episteme, even if we can't ever entirely get out of it. We are living within sort of modern conditions and we can't entirely dispose of the state. But what are the risks of us kind of running with that? Yeah.
Please, yeah.
Sorry, final. We have another person after you. Yeah.
No, just because the Indian Ocean came up,
Yeah.
it was one thing I also wanted to think about a little bit, especially when you talk about the dock workers in chapter 6. So you have this really, I mean, you talk about the dock workers as important for the biopolitical uprising as the people who kind of were really important to the strikes that allow for a lot of this to come together. And there's a place here where you say you kind of describe them really nicely, not just as workers in a highly productive industrial port city, but also as multiracial oceanic proletarians, bringing the radical traditions of the maritime world to bear on the hidebound terrestrialism of many decades of segregation. And then you tell us you can go on to talk about this Indian Ocean question, saying while dock workers punctured everyday life in apartheid's main port city, there are no archival traces of radical traditions revived by Indian Ocean peoples classified as Indian and colored in South Africa's racial formation. There is no interpretive means comparable to the archive of the Black Atlantic ready to hand. And so maybe I just wanted to bring those quotes to this conversation about kind of how to think about this radical moment from the Indian Ocean in ways that are different from how we talk about it when we center the Black Atlantic.
That's not the back.
So I'm an undergraduate student,
What's your name?
Abdurrahman. Abdurrahman, yeah. So I'm just strolling through, listening, hearing different perspectives, but it's quite complex for me to comprehend. But I did do some research on your book before I entered. So it's like, what I can understand is one point that your book, like, it makes a link from the apartheid, whatever, past to global neoliberalism. So what I'm interested in is asking the question I come up with is that with the current crisis like climate change or the rise of AI, like, do you see new global forces now mixing with the Apartheid Remains, like, so creating new kinds of challenges for communities like anyone? That's my question that I'm interested.
Yeah. And then this will be the last one because I think I'm going to overwhelm you.
No, no.
We'll have another round afterwards.
Pleasure not to talk.
Thanks, Sharad. This is not a question we'll really need. But my name is Dennis. But I'm as the Indian Ocean is coming up in the questions and Australia as well, which I wonder about. Pick up on this if you want to or not. But the something that the South African tradition of racial capitalism, I guess, builds on those early articulation of modes of production stuff. And what I really appreciated about what I've always found really productive about that early work by Wolpe and others was that whether or not it was foregrounded, the environment was always implicit in it. That
Interesting.
that the sort of shift from segregation to apartheid as a new regime of racial capitalism was engendered by a collapse in part, at least, by an environmental collapse in the reserves. So I feel like written right from the very beginning of this South African tradition, the environment is this sort of specter, and the Indian and I wonder now about just the Indian Ocean, because there's sorry, I'm thinking about this on the spot. I'm not, but there's a political ecology to this as well about kind of moving away from the Atlantic and sort of like moving away from, also I think moving away from a kind of capitalism radiating from the metropole in London out to South Africa and other peripheries. Once the Indian Ocean is taken seriously in this, then a place like Australia, I think, becomes central. I'm thinking in particular here, my own research is on trees in Johannesburg, and the importance of trees to the gold mining revolution there, about cheap nature essentially, where South Africa is an arid place, so European forestry practices couldn't really work. There's a lot of new forestry methods that came in order to get these Australian trees to work in the South African environment. And so eucalyptus becomes this like, I think this like key sort of unexplored actor in the development of South African racial capitalism and what it did in Johannesburg and elsewhere. And then from there, that forestry knowledge gets exported to India and elsewhere in Asia as well. But so this is, I suppose, just to make some sort of comment about, or just I suppose to add the political ecology of that Indian Ocean world of racial capitalism.
So I just want to say you don't have to answer all the questions. Maybe
No.
pick and choose.
No, I can just revel in how brilliant they are.
Of,
Yeah.
engagement.
So Durban riots, I mean, Dennis might have more to offer. I don't know. I think I don't have what was the guy who wrote, I think, the most brilliant thing on it? Is it Discussant in New York? You know what I'm talking about? Political scientist from Durban. That guy. Anyway, You know,
Radio.
no, not now, no. Anyway, I'll remember him later. But I mean, I think there is a story. I'm not sure if the story of those, you know, the political forms that emerged that assemble, you know, and the kind of it's a different story of apartheid remains that emerges when you look at those riots, right? I mean, look at all the kind of sort of intermediaries who emerge as so powerful. I mean, this is opaque to a lot of people here, so I think I don't have very much to say about it. I think it's an interesting question. I think I was just commanded by Adam Habib before this, and he was telling me that he thought that Durban's seeing better times in the last 9 months, which I didn't. We've got to find out what Adam's talking about. That there's some shift in the last 9 months, and anyway. I don't know much more, but I do have some thoughts on the queer stuff, which I've got a book coming out at the end of the year on Bev Ditzi, which you mentioned. Yes. Anyway, Lucy, I don't, there are different ways to think about the biopolitics concept, obviously, and I don't take it to mean all forms of politics of life as equivalent to social reproduction. You know, they're different concepts. I take them much more. I try to trace this, that there is this kind of interesting thing that emerged from the I think it came out of South Africa. I think Keith Breckenridge is actually kind of key figure in this, and reading the history of forms of biopolitical expertise in relation to transatlantic progressivism, which is comes back to Abu Rami's book on Palestine, Israel, and then a Marxist reading of those forms of those techniques that emerge. I think Foucault does have an insight, you know, that these are forms of expertise, that they are meant to be, you know, that they're meant to be subjectivating. They're meant to change people's subjectivities, or make people self-discipline in particular ways, and that they're meant to, that these can work from afar and so on, but given the right calculative tools and so on, and that set of things, obviously, you know, that the insight that the kind of scholars of the colonies show is that you never have all those things coming together as an assemblage in the same way as you do in, you know, Charles Booth's mapping of poverty in London or something like that. You have very different. You have the forms of the techniques emerging with much more coercive attempts at transforming personhood, forcing people's, the transformation, not exactly of personhood, but of form of conditions of life. And so, and those colonial and post-colonial trajectories do seem to be productive of struggle. But I think those struggles are also on the terrain of these instruments of biopolitical intervention. This is also pertinent to Australia and thinking about, you know, thinking across these sites. So that's sort of where I'm going with that. That then, read in a Marxist way, that you can think about these forms of expertise and as tools of struggle, and people do pick them up, and that's what I'm interested in. I don't think it maps on, you know, perfectly onto. It might map onto those healthcare committees. You know, it could be a story that, you know, could be told, but not all forms of. You know, it may or may not work. It's not. I summarize. Mira also asked me this, like, is it, you know, this focus on biopolitical struggle, is that as the kind of like key site of, you know, that may work in some places and sometimes it happens to be an interesting thing in this story, and it may not be in others. You know, also, yeah, and I think those are maybe the pitfalls of. Kind of, you know, focus on biopolitical, that there are pitfalls in assuming that this is the kind of crucial side of struggle, something like that. But that's where, yeah. On Samia, on yeah, this notion of country is interesting. I think in South Africa, its history of land and of nature. So, like, I don't think one would. Maybe there are actually we do have very different histories of the homelands now. Very different kind of revisionist histories and political economies. I think of Gavin Capp's work. Um, but I think. Yeah, I think so. I think that may be an interesting thing to look at. I was like the doctor writing prescriptions. Like, this is what you should look at. I don't know. You know more than me, but it's an interesting. I didn't know anything about the kind of the ways in which Aboriginal land rights struggles take on or engage notions of Black politics. That's part of what you're. I'd like to know more about that. And Majid, I mean, I think how do you know I'm not so invested in there is an important, actually interesting, that kind of lapsed debate about regions and geography, right? It's interesting. We do. I think the interesting thing now for our time is to think in more creative ways about spatial objects of analysis, right? And Indian Ocean. Yeah, this is where I should take your point that I should try to think synthetically across some of your points. Okay, Indian Ocean studies. I mean, every kind of sort of regional historiography has its like sort of settled ways of thinking, and so does Indian Ocean studies, obviously. But I do think there are some openings for. I mean, geography is a nice place to think from, right, about these things because we can really do whatever we want. We really don't have a lot. We do have a lot of space, and also for thinking about the object of analysis and how it, and I'm not done with this notion of the interaction of the Indian Ocean and Black radical tradition. I do think that notion of that notion of ontologizing Blackness it has its American provenance, obviously, but that's also kind of a state critique of Afro-pessimism at this point. I've been thinking about I thought about those two chapters 4 and 9 because also I think that chapter 9 was about the saboteurs and so on. There's something about the kind of ways in which the people in that moment deal with the boundaries between crime and politics and I think there's something there that echoes something about they sit with the racial wound that it actually echoes some of these US Black studies ways of thinking. It's not very I'm trying to push against a notion that the Indian Ocean has some kind of distinctiveness. I think it's an interestingly open, nonlinear, space actually, right? So, and maybe we should do Indo-Pacific actually. Maybe that's the way to think. But it's also a way of breaking from some of the kind of claims in Black studies that are about Black Atlantic and modernity and all that. As I mean, it just helps us think in nonlinear ways, I think. Thank you, Sarah, for that point about the dock worker strikes. And I mean, I did kind of like there are lots of moments of whimsy, there's moments of throwing caution to the, and then but the end, the coda picks up on that point that we don't know the spark that started these dock worker strikes in a sense. I mean, we have some accounts. One of the great the sort of historian of that has just passed away, Dave Hemson. His account was more like it's about the relations, the landed relations in a way. It's about the intermediaries and in the docks and so on. It's not so much about the radical traditions of seafarers and whether there's any kind of connection. And so I kind of end with that, like that as a kind of like, you know, we don't know something. We don't know something about the a maritime history of that. And that I didn't maybe emphasize enough, but those dock worker strikes of 1972, 73, which then turned into this wider sort of, well, they are a crucial moment in the kind of like dismantling of apartheid. Dave Hampson famously said, you know, it's the beginning of the fall, the end. But anyway, that's where that's that kind of claim about beginnings is always a bit of a yeah. Abraham, your question. Yeah, I think that the thing to do with these big questions is, from my perspective, you know, about, you know, these kind of seemingly sort of impossible, I mean, dizzying questions of our time, right? Of like, you know, planetary climate change, genocide, AI, all of it converging in our universities as like, can our universities be places of actual critical learning and questioning and a refusal of things as they are? I think one useful thing for me is to ground it in activism of some kind. Is actually a nice place to begin, in places that where you see people struggling with these things and looking out from there, and, you know, and reading and kind of getting a sense of what they're up to in not necessarily as one of them, but as a fellow traveler, you know, as a scholar, fellow traveler, thinking with them with that wider sense in mind. That's sort of my way of doing this. I'm right now working on one person. I've just finished this book on this one Black lesbian activist in Joburg, and trying to just think of her story of struggle and sexuality and struggle, and it doesn't get easier with staying with one person. I thought it might be nice to just think. It's actually, you know, very hard because it's anyway. But especially when you disagree, you know, when you see that they're like all these Black lesbians like fighting over the same. These, you know, there's a lot to say, but it's a nice way of I think a nice a way of attending to these deep questions that we face and grounding it, you know. So that's how I would deal with it, not keeping it abstract, because then, you know, it seems like it's just unchangeable, right? Yeah. Yeah, Dennis, you know, I taught your sister, didn't I? I taught your sister. She's brilliant. Yeah. You gotta tell me what she's up to. Yeah, she's really brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I agree with, yeah. So thinking about it's really, I not thought about that actually. Obviously, and the environment is a spectrum. I mean, it's also Fernando Corneille's argument that we need to think from nature and think with land, labor, and capital, and think about nature in the story of story of capital from elsewhere. Yeah, I'm looking forward to your book on trees in Johannesburg. Cheap nature. Yeah, I mean, I think it's the, you know, thinking about that South African tradition of racial capitalism with Alista Battistoni's, right? And, you know, these generations, that would be very exciting. Well, because Alex has been doing this. Alex Loftus years. Been doing this work. You might have some thoughts on this, Alex.
I mean, I was wondering, the book's bookended with the refinery, obviously, but it begins with the project that you were embarking on, which was more focused on environmental justice. But then you abandoned that. And then when you return to the refinery at the end, your planetary's there. And so there's this shift from a very situated perspective on the environment to one which is much more planetary. And between that, I wondered whether you're thinking about the environment. I mean, again, another question was about the writing of the book, because I saw you present this book 16 years ago.
That's true.
Just what it must have been like to spend so long with this material. It's amazing. But yeah, where you're thinking about the environment is, having moved from a project that was planned on environmental justice, but then ends with much more planetary thinking.
It wasn't exactly planned as environmental justice. I mean, like early on, I mean, I don't know, because I was wrestling with those things that I talked about that is relegated to a section of the introduction, right? The contract labor stuff, environmental justice, and what's happening in community. And also, I started off doing ethnography of a kind, and then retreated into the archives, and then I kept going back in time and back deeper, and then was just something else. Yeah, and perhaps even so, I could have brought done what Dennis is asking about, done a different genealogy of the environment in this story. That's a different kind of thing that could be part of this, and thinking about the place of land, labor, land, environment, nature in all these forms. It's interesting. I think that is something that would be a different way to think about this milieu. I didn't do that. How do we know what we're doing in this line of work? Abu your professors of, in a sense, you should always treat them with as profound skepticism, because to profess means, it's like professing the faith, right? It's like, I really think this. It's up insincerely, actually. They're not, you gotta push back because we don't actually know what we're doing. And especially in research, it takes so long, and so much of it is shaped by, the world and writing for so long. Things change. Like our way of seeing is shapes so much of the thing we produce, right? The books we write.
So we have a little bit more time if anybody else wants to make a comment or ask a question.
To the discussion about the biopolitics and biopolitical struggle, and
today.
kind of, and Sharad, you're saying, like, someone asked you if it was enough for the primary terrain. It reminds me of, in Pakistan, there's a figure, Abdul Sattar Eidi, who organized a vast network of ambulances and orphanages, and kind of, a rapid response much far outweighs the state's provision of this sort of healthcare. And it is something that's very much helping people where they need it the most, but it's apolitical in this sense. So I think the impression I got from the book was not these things happening in isolation, but this ecosystem, this web of kind of intellectuals and activists and experts and professionals and grassroots, so musicians, and it's like that interactive web, I think, is there. Whereas I look at Abdul Sattar Eidi, he's kind of a hero in the sense of alone, like it's often portrayed that way. So I think the question of where it becomes political, it depends on the place-based sort of connections or something like that.
And what kind of politics biopolitics doesn't have an intrinsic politics, I think. That's crucial.
Yep.
Hi, Henrike. I was glad, Sharad, that finally you came back to people, actually.
To what?
To people.
To people, yes.
And my feeling all the way through was that one of the interesting things that seems to emerge from what you're trying to do here, and I have not read the whole thing, is to kind of make sure that nobody realizes people can hold all sorts of beliefs in their head and they can be contradictory. So you can actually be not hoping and you can be hoping, and you can do that at the same time. So I was kind of quite struck by the fact that in a way the focus on the neighborhood, right, kind of purifies the fact that people can be activists and they can still be very much invested in a big kind of state-run biosocial projects. I was just at a screening of a film on midwives in Turkey. Mm-hmm. And I do think the midwife is one of these really interesting figures that is very often dragged into modernity by engaging with larger state project, and at the same time very often holding on behalf of a community to the community, to hope, but also to kind of other kinds of knowledge. So I'm just wondering, is there a way that the neighborhood takes away from that?
What do you mean?
Um,
You're a scholar of the neighborhoods. You're gonna have more to tell me.
sorry?
You're a scholar of neighborhoods. You gotta tell me what you mean.
No, what I mean is that I always felt the focus on the neighborhood is an easy way out of all these contradictions that emerge when you actually engage with the other book that you're writing, but which is with one person.
Well, I don't. Partly because I think in the chronology of the research, I was early on. I was hanging out in the neighborhoods, and maybe also yeah, and playing anthropologist, and also maybe more like there's one guy in the neighborhood read something I'd written, and he's like, what is this piece? I don't know all these names, like that I've never heard of this person as well. I said they're pseudonyms. I changed the names, I changed names. He was like angry with me. It's like, but so I didn't have that dialogue after a while, right? Because I was doing archival stuff and then doing other, just rewriting. So I for like 15 years or something like that, 10. So I don't think I have a romance of the neighborhood, and if that's what you're getting at, I don't think at least the intention. And I don't know if people, although, that for the reader to tell me. The intention was to also break from the sort of neighborhood, like the local histories. There's a major thing in South Africa, local history, the tradition of social histories off a town, or I'm trying to break from that as well by looking at these relationally, and the spatial object changes actually in various ways. What do you think? Is it dramatic? Sometimes. Sometimes. No. But it does, the site of the activism is a kind of neighborhood activism. A crucial site anyway. There are other kinds of politics that actually shift in and out of it though. Like these figures in the armed struggle or whatever.
I'm gonna jump in on a slightly different note. I mean, we've already touched on a little bit on the question of temporality, and I was very excited by the way you used Butler's reading of Benjamin, and you sort of said you kind of flirted with this idea of, okay, we talk about black Marxism. What would it mean to think about black Benjamin, and what does it do for the way we're looking at this archive and the kind of interlacing of historical time with messianic time? I guess the other thing that came to mind, it's in some ways a very kind of obvious, predictable question. It's difficult for somebody like me, and I'm sure other people in the room, not to read a text about apartheid as something that harbors possibilities for the future in terms of how we're thinking about Palestine. So for this text coming out at this sort of political moment, and a text that I think, from what I understand you to be saying, wasn't originally going to be so archival, wasn't going to maybe produce this kind of arc that you have from the early 20th century up until the sort of contemporary period. But you've done that very successfully, and it's kind of incredible. But rather than sort of reading it through the lens of the past, it's hard not to try and read into it or through it the question of possibilities for the future, or again, sort of pitfalls. And so I'd really like to hear more about how you think we might be able to think Palestine through a text on South Africa, or re-engaging the question of apartheid in South Africa, or how we might not. Is that sort of a false sort of hope?
No, I think it is a question I think it's a very important question, and it's also a very important question without all the facile answers. I mean, there are people in this room who also have things to say. full of better things to say, but I'd say from my way of thinking, that the apartheid analogy doesn't work in some ways and is important in some ways. Like I think, well, I think Nasser's what is it called? The politics in the concrete? Is that what it's called?
The time beneath the concrete.
Time beneath the concrete. Oh yeah, time beneath the concrete. It's the history of space making and the stuff about his account of planning. I think I would read it in parallel to this as a question of biopolitics of planning. It's caught up in such a different way in which because it's about the camp. It's about camps, right? Also, but then there's the parallel to the political stuff in my book there, in Nasser's work and in his article in Critical Times it's about this political uprising and a kind of commune, but it's the commune in the camp, and so that actually does bring the military and the commune from the chapter 6 and 7 maybe together, the insurrectionary. Okay, but that doesn't. So there are some threads in a way. If my analysis of apartheid was that we have to look back at histories of the biopolitics of space in personhood space of breaking down in South African historiography the transition from segregation to apartheid, thinking expansively across that period. I think one could think in parallel about the history of space in Palestine and Israel and the kinds of struggles that emerge in relation to it, rather than the kind of facile apartheid analogies, right? But then there's another question, that the question of apartheid in international law is another thing, another kind of question, right? That's another that's actually, that's another kind of, that's actually in terms of the apartheid analogy, I think that's the more interesting one. And of course, it's interesting that South Africans are so crucial in that indictment of in international law. That's what I have to think with there. I don't know. I mean, I wish Lale was in the room, because she says like, this is great to get like a devastating, like the review you don't want. She writes, that this is she found it interesting to read this in relation to this time and in relation to, but I would like to know a bit more about why and how we should ask her.
Any final questions, comments?
Black Benjamin on the I think is actually, I should have gone to Fred Moten. I think Fred Moten is the Black Benjamin in some ways, and any one figure who's thinking that.
Okay, so we thank both Sharad and Sarah for their
Thank you.
comments.
Yeah, that's our chance.
We will be back
I got it.
on Thursday the 12th with Julia Ayashar. So thanks everyone for coming, and hope to see you again.